there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on.
In 2015, Leeton schoolteacher Stephanie Scott was preparing to become a bride for the very first time. She was excited to walk down the aisle to marry Aaron Leeson Woolley, her partner of 5 years. And by Easter Sunday, April 5, most of the plans were already finalised for the ceremony that would be happening just 6 days later in the central west town of Yagowra. She only had a few more things to check off her list, making sure the bus company had her reservation for her wedding guests confirmed, and to finish off the lesson plans that she was putting in place for the substitute teacher who would step into her classroom while she was on her honeymoon in Tahiti. Stephanie was known for her kindness and dedication. So when she wished the cleaner at the school where she worked, where she'd gone to tick some of those final things off her to-do list, a happy Easter, she meant it. But she didn't know that the man she'd just spoken to had been watching her, and the predator inside him was fixated on a dark urge to kill. I'm Claire Murphy, standing in for Gemma Bath, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. The death of 26-year-old Stephanie Scott rocked the small New South Wales community where she lived and worked, but the brutal way in which she died and the fact that she was less than a week away from her wedding day made her story all the more tragic. Even more devastating was that she wasn't supposed to be there that day, and scarily, wasn't even her killer's intended victim. By the time her family gathered to say goodbye to her in the very same place she was due to be married, two brothers, located in two different states, were behind bars. And the story as to how Stephanie became their target shocked the entire nation. Sarah Crawford is a journalist who's been following this story since that day in 2015. And as we mark 10 years since Stephanie's senseless death, Sarah sat down with us to help us better understand the crime and who Stephanie Scott was a decade on. Sarah, I'm really interested to find out about when you first started hearing about the case involving Stephanie Scott. How did that sort of initially make you feel when you first heard about the crime that had been committed against her? How did you respond to it?
Well, at the time, I was the court reporter in Sydney at the newspaper that I worked at. I wasn't the police reporter. So I wasn't there on the ground when her body was found. But as usual, it comes through as a police press release. And then they're usually really scant details. And then there has to be a decision made on, okay, so it's at Leeton, we've got to fly out there. Has this person just gone missing? Have they decided to run away? Or is this a potential crime? So those decisions need to be made, and they need to be made pretty fast. And because of the nature of this case, there was a lot of interest in who she was and what could possibly have happened to a woman who vanishes 6 days before her wedding. It was, of course it captures your attention. And so they made a decision pretty fast to send reporters down there. And that was the case for a lot of the news outlets in Sydney at the time.
So you were covering court proceedings at the time. Is that when you really started to hear the details of what was happening with this case when it went to court?
So with this case, Vincent Stanford was arrested quite quickly afterwards and made a confession to police. So therefore, details about the case really shut down. The investigation was over. They had the accused, and so the information stopped. All we knew is that she was murdered and her remains were found in Kokopara National Park. But beyond that, we didn't know the details. We didn't know the motive behind the crime. And that remained that way for a year until his brother was sentenced His brother was sentenced for being an accessory after the fact to murder because he sold 2 rings that Vincent Stanford took off her body. So he was sentenced before his brother. So it was at his sentencing that the details of the case finally came out, and they were really, really disturbing.
Well, let's go back in time and first talk about Stephanie herself because, as you said, people were really quite taken by this story right from the get-go. And this is something we do see happen quite regularly in Australia, is that if she is a young woman, especially if she's a young white woman who's an attractive young white woman, and that added detail of it being within a week of her wedding, why do you think the country was so taken with Stephanie's story when so many women disappear across Australia every year?
Yeah, I wonder this every time with certain crime cases, why they really spark the public sympathy over others. I mean, in Sydney especially. I mean, Sydney has a real interest in crime. Growing up in Sydney, there's always been big crime cases that have really captured the attention of people. Stephanie Scott's murder is definitely in there with a lot of other cases like the murder of Keisha Abrahams, the little girl that was murdered by her parents, or even the murder of Anita Cobby back in the 80s, which is a huge case in Sydney. It falls into that category, and I think it's because, unfortunately, some people are considered to be perfect victims, and I don't really like that phrase. I don't think that one victim of crime is more deserving of our sympathy than others, but she was a woman who was in a place where she should have been safe, in the school, in her workplace. And she was randomly attacked by a stranger. And those crimes are incredibly rare. And when they do happen, they capture our attention. I'm just thinking about the young woman, Jill Marr, who was murdered in Melbourne a few years earlier by someone randomly who attacked her on the street. It's a very rare case. And I think that's why these cases capture our attention. And also, you have someone who was about to celebrate what should have been the happiest day of her life. And then that was taken away from her. So I think a lot of women can relate to her because I think a lot of us, we naturally, it's always in the back of our mind when we're in public spaces. We naturally feel unsafe. And what is for a lot of women, you know, their sort of their secret fear, for her actually happened where she was attacked by a stranger.
Well, let's talk about that day. It's Easter Sunday, 2015. Stephanie Scott goes into the school where she works in Leeton, but why has she gone in on a Sunday on essentially a long weekend when nobody else was there?
Because she's a teacher, and every time you go on holidays, you have to fill in and do all the extra work while you're away. That's what I thought as soon as I saw it. She was going in because she was going to go on her honeymoon, and so she was doing some extra work to help the relief teacher out that was going to take over her space for while she was on a holiday. That's why she was in there. She went to a colleague's house. She got the keys from her. She went into the school space. She disarmed the alarm, and she went into the staff room and sat down at a computer to do the lessons for the relief teacher and also to make sure some last-minute payments for bookings for her wedding were completed. Vincent Stanford was there and saw her. He had actually been there since 7:30 a.m. in the morning for no reason. He later told police he was bored, and so he went to the school and was just randomly cleaning out certain areas of the school, even though he had no authority to be there at all. And then as she was leaving, she walked down the hall, saw him and said, "Happy Easter," and then went to get her keys, and that's when he attacked her.
So before he attacked Stephanie, Stanford went home and came back to the school. Do we know why he did that?
No, we don't know why he did that, but we can assume why he did that because the later police investigation found that he had essentially a rape kit in his bedroom. He had a 40-centimetre knife, yellow duct tape, handcuffs, condoms and lubricants. And following her murder and her body being found during the police search of his property, they did find that he had Googled search terms leading up to the event, such as bride rape and really violent sexual offences. So we can assume that he went home to get those things once he found that she was at the school.
So we're assuming he's gone home to retrieve that, what they're referring to as a rape kit.
Mm.
And in there is a knife. Is that what he used to murder Stephanie?
No. So the autopsy report found that he grabbed her as she was leaving and dragged her into a small room that had once been used as a dark room. And on the way, she's dropped things out of her bag. He's thrown her into the room. She's attempted to escape. He has pushed her back down onto the ground, and then he hit her 30 to 40 times in the face, causing severe head injuries. Then she was sexually assaulted, and then he stabbed her with the 40-centimetre knife. So the autopsy found that she died of blunt force trauma.
What did he then initially do with Stephanie's body? Obviously, there's not going to be anybody there for the rest of Easter Sunday or even the day after because it's a public holiday. So what does he do in the immediate aftermath of the murder?
Well, this is where it gets really disturbing. He then went home to where he lived with his mother and his older brother, and he had a cheese sandwich and a cup of coffee, and then came back and then spent several hours with a high-pressure hose cleaning up that dark room. He also removed her body and put it in the boot of her car on top of some tarp material. And he got the yellow duct tape and tried to seal her neck wound as well. So he did this over several hours, and then he drove his vehicle back to the home that he shared with his mother and his elder brother.
We found out some really disturbing things about Vincent Stanford in the aftermath of Stephanie's death, and that he did actually have a history of violent thoughts and violent behaviour dating back to when he was a child growing up in the Netherlands, and he'd even targeted a teacher once before. Can you just explain to us what we found out about Vincent's childhood?
Yes, so we only found out who this person was that had committed this shocking crime at his sentence hearing, which was more than a year after her death. So he was interviewed when he was in custody by a forensic psychologist and a forensic psychiatrist. And from their reports, we found out that he was born in Australia. He moved to the Netherlands when he was 3 with his mother, father, twin brother, and older brother. And he told psychiatrists that he started developing violent thoughts when he was about 7 or 8, feeling a need to kill someone. It was only when he was 12 that it appeared that he acted on these violent thoughts when he attempted to choke a teacher at a school in the Netherlands. And after that, he was put into a mental health ward. And then he left school at 16. The family returned to Australia about a year before Stephanie Scott's murder, and they rented a house in Leeton, and he worked as a cleaner, a casual cleaner. But there's no prior convictions for violence with Vincent Stanford. This was his first offence.
We did actually find out what that child psychologist had diagnosed Stanford with, though, back then. What did they say was the state of his mental health?
They said that he had structural faults in his personality. He had a personality disorder. And she said that he found it really hard to interact with people. He found spending any time with people incredibly stressful. And that he felt frustrated by his own inadequacies and frustrated by those around him, and that those frustrations would build into a sense of violence until he told her that he had an urge to kill, and it was a continuous thought. And one of the things that he said, which is really striking, is that he was amazed that with this anger and violence inside him, that he survived for 25 years in society.
without killing anybody up to this point. Is that what he meant?
Mm.
Right.
It makes it seem like it was an inevitable outcome for him.
Now, you mentioned there he got a job cleaning at the school. He's got a history of violence as a child.
Mm.
We know in the Netherlands, before they did move back to Australia, that he had trouble finding a job there. He had enrolled to study IT in a college and wasn't accepted, and then he tried to get into the army and they told him his social skills weren't good enough. How did he manage to not only secure a job with this cleaning company but also pass the working with children check? Do we know? I'm presuming he did pass that check at some stage.
I don't know. That never came out. And the other really big question that's raised with this case is that he was told that he was only meant to be in that school before and after school, those designated hours to do his cleaning. He wasn't meant to be there when there were kids around, and he certainly wasn't meant to have access to the alarm access codes. Yet he managed to get the alarm access codes within a week of starting there as a casual cleaner, and he was there all the time, even on the weekends. And he was even seen in the girls' toilets while the girls were in there. Why nothing was done about it, it raises a lot of questions.
We've gotten to the point in Stephanie's story where we know that he's put her in the trunk of the car and taken it back to his family home. What do we know happens to Stephanie after that?
So in the early hours of the morning, he goes to a petrol station. He fills up a 20-litre jerry can of fuel. He takes the car out to Kokopara National Park, where he burns the body and like a sun visor from the car as well. Before he burnt her body, he turned on his phone, which he had turned off hours earlier, and took some photographs of her. And then after that, he drove the car to a canal outside of Leeton, and then he got out and walked home. And then he had a couple of hours sleep and went to the supermarket to meet his mum to go grocery shopping.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with journalist Sarah Crawford about the case of Stephanie Scott. Up next, I ask Sarah how the police connected Vincent to Stephanie's disappearance. How did police connect him to Stephanie's disappearance?
As Vincent Stanford was shopping for groceries with his mum, Stephanie Scott's fiancé was waking up in their house worried because she hadn't been there the night before. He made a few phone calls and then he went to police, reported her disappearance. And police checked her phone, her social media, her bank account. There'd been no activity since Sunday morning. So then they started making inquiries. And it was the fact that Vincent Stanford's car was seen around the school, parked outside the school for long periods of time over that Easter long weekend, that they went to his house. They went to his house on the Tuesday afternoon, so 2 days after Stephanie was murdered, and they just asked him, were you at the school? Did you see anything? He said no, and he said, good luck with your investigation. And then there was the following day that things started to really unravel for him very rapidly.
So what happened to really set police on the path? Did they discover something at the crime scene? Was there something that they said, okay, we've spoken to this man, he said good luck with your investigation? How did they then turn their light back on him from that point?
They told him to go into the police station for a recorded interview on the Wednesday afternoon, which he gave. He said he didn't see Stephanie. He was at the school. And he also said that he'd gone to the supermarket on the Sunday, which set alarm bells off for the police. I mean, they were already suspicious of him, but set alarm bells off further because he'd actively lied because the supermarket wasn't open. So police then went to his house that evening and searched it. And that's where they found the evidence that linked him to the crime. So it was the tyre tracks of a car that was smaller than his, so clearly not his car, that were in the towards the edge of the backyard, there was a used condom, the duct tape. But the real key was that in his bedroom, they found the school keys that her friend had given her on that Sunday morning. And that's when he was arrested.
So how long between Stanford's arrest and the discovery of Stephanie's body?
The body was discovered the following day. So he was taken back to the police station and he's charged with murder. They also then find Stephanie's car outside of Leeton. The following day, a search begins of Kokopara National Park, and the police are helped by his mother and older brother, who know that he liked to go to that area. So there was a massive search, and it was only, I think, police officers that were on bikes that stumbled across her remains.
Stephanie's family would go back out to that site where she was found with metal detectors looking for those rings that we talked about earlier, her engagement ring and a ring that was given to her by her parents on her graduation. And they talked about seeing the scene there, the charred leftovers of where their daughter had lain. But obviously they were never going to find those rings, but they didn't know that. Why did Stanford mail them to his twin brother? Because his twin wasn't living in New South Wales, he was living in South Australia. Why did he mail those along, I believe, with her driver's licence to him?
We won't know. He never answered that question. But he mailed them on the Wednesday after he went in to do a police statement. His behaviour, I mean, even after he went in to do the police statement on the Wednesday, just saying, I was at the school, I didn't see her, I was at the supermarket. After that, he then went back to the national park to look at her body again and then went to check on the car. And then he mailed the 2 rings and the driver's licence to his brother in South Australia and said, I need you to look after these things for me. I mean, maybe he was removing evidence, but then why would you send them to a relative for keeping? It seemed like he wanted to take souvenirs from his crime.
Was that what those photos were about too? And how did he explain that away? Because I'm presuming police would have checked his phone after his arrest. How does he explain photos of Stephanie's burnt body there?
He said that he had downloaded them from the internet because he thought they were funny. Yeah. So no, he didn't really have an explanation at all for that. I mean, he also took her red bra that she was wearing and they found that in his wardrobe as well, in his bedroom.
So he really collected quite a few treasures, I guess he would consider them as, in the aftermath of this crime. So you mentioned that he spoke to a forensic psychologist and a forensic psychiatrist after his arrest. What else do we find out about Stanford? Because I understand he explained to them that he has almost no emotions and that one of the only emotions that he ever experiences is hatred. And I know that you said that he said it was inevitable that he would probably one day kill somebody, but do we have any handle on sort of what type of personality Stanford is? Because it seems like he's very detached from reality.
Yes. And I think that the assessment of him was also fairly limited because he wouldn't participate in it. What we do know is that he has structural faults in his personality. He has very little empathy for other people. And he said that he just had an urge to kill. When he was interviewed by police in the recorded interview, he was incredibly emotionless. He was even very emotionless at his sentencing. He just kept his head down the whole time. And yes, he didn't look at the family. He didn't express any sort of interest in his surroundings at all.
How did the family cope with the court case and then the sentencing? Did they give victim impact statements? Did they let the public know how this has affected them?
The family had been fairly clearly, obviously private from the time of her murder. They did a few interviews after his arrest, but we hadn't really heard from them until that sentencing hearing in Griffith a year later. And part of sentencing hearings it's the one opportunity that victims get to express their loss. And that was the first time that we really heard in depth from the family. Stephanie's mother gave the victim impact statement, which I think is just incredibly brave. I don't know. Yeah, she stood in the courtroom next to her husband and gave this really moving statement about her grief and also the loss of a really wonderful daughter and person who brought a lot of joy to everyone's life. Her fiancé didn't give a victim impact statement. He kept his head down the whole time, was supported by family. He really did look like it was incredibly hard moment for him. It was a hard moment. It was tough. It was a tough couple of hours in the courtroom, that's for sure.
I understand they also held her funeral in the place where they would have been married, which is such a sad thing for them to experience in a place that should have been bringing them so much joy.
Yeah. It was the only venue in Leeton that could hold everyone. There was a real, there was a big outpouring across the country for Stephanie Scott, but in Leeton as well, that was a community that was fairly traumatised by that experience. Just the shock of a random attack on someone without explanation, and a very much a woman that was really connected to the community. She'd worked at the school for 3 years. She was the drama teacher. They had a big farewell for her the Thursday before she was meant to go on her wedding and honeymoon leave. And there was a lot of sadness. The other thing is, which is really sad, is on the following Saturday, which should have been her wedding day, everyone gathered to release balloons for her. And her fiancé released the balloons and let out a cry as he did so. It must have been a really heartfelt, tragic moment for that community.
After the break, we uncover the surprising details of who Vincent Stanford's original target was, and it wasn't Stephanie Scott. What people might have missed in Stephanie Scott's story is that potentially Stephanie, even though Stanford did Google things like, how to kill a bride-to-be or something along those lines, which made it look very premeditated. And the fact that he already had this quote-unquote rape kit already organised and ready to go, is that potentially Stephanie wasn't his intended victim, in that someone much younger was in his sights.
Yeah, that only came out at the sentencing, and that was really shocking. It was such a terrible crime. It's hard to believe that he may have been planning something far worse. There was a 12-year-old girl that lived near to his house in the neighbourhood, and police found thousands of photographs of her and a notebook where he documented her movements and the number plates of people that came to the house. And he also told the psychologist that if he had abducted this young girl, that he probably would have killed her. That girl was one of a number of women, or females, I should say, that he'd been stalking around Leeton. There was also a young woman at the supermarket who he was watching, and one day she went to the supermarket 5 minutes before opening and then saw him with his car parked in the staff area away from everyone else. And she just decided she was just going to wait in that car until her male staff members came along and she'd walk in together. She had a sense. There was another teacher at Leeton, one of Stephanie's colleagues, that had to stay back a lot for her job. And so when she left, she was usually the last to leave, and she would see his car a lot in the car park, and he'd be waiting.
It really is the stuff of nightmares, isn't it? Because we know statistically that the people who are the most dangerous to women in Australia is more often than not someone in their own home, a partner. But this is the stuff of nightmares, because we do worry that a strange man in a place where we usually feel safe would make that place not safe anymore. But has Stanford ever shown any remorse for anything that he's done, including the murder of Stephanie Scott?
No. He told the psychologist that he doesn't really think about it, and that after he murdered Stephanie, the urge to kill dissipated for 2 months and then came back. I think the lack of remorse, as well as the extreme violent random nature of the crime, are part of the reasons for his incredibly tough sentence that he received.
What did the judge say when he did hand down that very lengthy sentence?
Well, the sentence is life. And when you get a life sentence, it means that you will not leave jail. And to give that to someone who was 24 at the time and had no past convictions, there was a reason why his defense lawyer was arguing for a lengthy sentence but not life, because of his age. But Justice Hume determined that it was the nature of the crime, the violent nature of the crime, and the community's need for justice and the potential for him doing something like that again. They were some of the main reasons why he took the decision to sentence Vincent to life in jail. He will stay there forever now. He's not leaving. And what's even more interesting about this is that he never appealed that sentence. He had the opportunity within 28 days of being sentenced to appeal it. And an appeal was lodged. But then they had 6 months in which to make that formal appeal, and they never did. And you'd think that if you were sentenced to life in prison and you were, 25 when he was finally sentenced, you've got nothing to lose by appealing. I mean, you've got to wonder why he never appealed.
Do you have a theory on that?
Well, I mean, I just go back to those comments that he made that he did pretty well to last for 25 years in society. Part of me thinks that maybe jail feels better for him. Maybe he wants to stay in jail.
I was reading that he did also tell the psychologist that he was more comfortable being by himself in his safe cell. He hums the MacGyver tune to himself while he creates scars in his skin. Like, he's obviously not a well person. And maybe you're right. Maybe he did, some part of himself, understand that being locked away is probably better for both him and the rest of society.
Yes, maybe that's the case. Yeah, I think there's still a lot of, there always will be unanswered questions with this case, because the only other person who witnessed that crime was Stephanie, and she can't tell us what really happened. All we have to go on is what Vincent finally told police when he confessed. And a lot of what he said, it doesn't really make sense. The fact that he said that it was a random attack, that he hadn't planned it, that he'd never met Stephanie before. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that he was taking steps to abduct and sexually assault a female in Leeton. And unfortunately, Stephanie was the one that walked into that school on Easter Sunday.
Of course, Vincent wasn't the only one of the Stanford family who would face punishment for this crime, because his brother in Adelaide ended up hocking those rings and getting money for them. Did he face consequences for that?
Yes, he did. Yes. Those rings were her engagement ring and her what's called a crossover ring, a graduation ring that her mother gave her, and she always wore them. So Marcus Stanford would have received the rings and the driver's license in the mail after his brother was arrested for the murder. He would have known who those rings belonged to. And then he holds on to them for a month. And then he only goes to hock them at the beginning of May, and then soon after he's arrested. At his sentencing, he got 15 months for accessory to murder after the fact. And there was a lot of public unhappiness, I wouldn't say maybe you could even say outrage. There was definitely a lot of public dissent to that sentence. But I think that people felt that they wanted a tougher sentence for the crime that had been committed by his brother rather than what he had done himself. What he had done was horrendous. But the 15 months, I think Justice Hume was restricted in what he could sentence him to. But there was a lot of public outcry. And then a couple of months later, when it was Vincent Stanford's turn to be sentenced, then we found out what Justice Hume believed the crime of murder should have received, which was the life sentence.
Did Marcus Stanford ever explain why he didn't go to police when he received those rings in the mail, knowing what his brother did? I mean, he apparently even took photos of them. Has he explained any of that?
No, he never explained why he did what he did. He just said, as you said, he took the photographs. He told them in case he needed to show them to police. But, I mean, we just don't know why he would have known that his brother had committed this crime. And he had the evidence of that crime and he chose not to say anything and then went and sold them.
Is there, when we look at silver linings, when awful things happen to really good people like happened to Stephanie Scott, do we see any silver linings and learnings from what happened to her? Did it change safety in the community of Leeton? Did it change safety around teachers in schools when, school's not in session? Do we see her death having impact on that community?
Well, I think the school would certainly have changed their procedures in regards to cleaners and who has access to their school after hours and their alarm access codes. What happened to Stephanie is so rare and unusual. It's hard to know what more can be done to protect yourself from a random stranger. But clearly she should have been safe in that school after hours, and she wasn't, because the protocols that have been put in place to allow people access to that school weren't being followed.
Just finally, Sarah, I'm interested in this from pure interest, but also because I'm a journalist too and I've been asked this question myself. When you cover cases like Stephanie Scott's, and it is, as you said, such a random and horrific thing, and it is nightmarish to think that that could potentially happen to any one of us at any time because, as you said, it's very difficult to pin down when or where this may happen. Does that impact you? Do you mentally become more afraid of the world when you report on stories like this?
Yes, I think I do. The chances of something horrible happening to me seem far more real, I think, than for other people, because I have reported on so many cases where people have been unlucky. With Stephanie's case, and this is something that I think we should remember, is that for 26 years of Stephanie's life, she was someone who was treasured, that impacted those around her, was well-loved, was a talented woman. And it's just that final 30 minutes that we know and we talk about. And I think that's the thing as well with victims, is that they become just the victim. I think we should remember who she was. And also, coming up to 10 years on her death, I do think about the family. I think the anniversaries are really hard for anyone that's lost a loved one, especially in these circumstances. And 10 years, that it's going to be a really tough time for that family.
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. We really appreciate you. And of course, we are sending all the support that we can to Stephanie's family at what must be a very difficult time for them. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much to Sarah for helping us tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Claire Murphy. The producer is Tali Blackman, with audio design by Jacob Round. Thank you for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.